Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Subplot, a Course, a podcast discussing a new science fiction literary work on the second Tuesday of every month by casual fans just like you. I'm Stavros, and with me is someone who only wishes he had the right connections to become a mediocre optometrist, Charlie. Say hi, Charlie.
So it goes.
That was going to be my line, Charlie.
All right.
Keep going.
All right, Charlie is a math teacher. And also with me is Vincent, who is looking into the frequency of PTSD being the main catalyst for the manifestation of time travel powers. Say hi, Vincent.
It was going to go, but Charlie stole my line, so hi.
Okay, and Vincent's an epidemiologist. And finally, we're also joined by John, who enjoys designing geodesic domes that are best used to spy on people. Say hi, John.
So it's going.
Okay, John is an aerospace engineer. Today we're going to be talking about Slaughterhouse Five, written by Kurt Vonnegut and published in 1969. So, of course, be prepared for spoilers. As far as the plot of this book, it's told in a non-linear fashion by an unreliable narrator who spins the tale of Billy Pilgrim, a rather incompetent U.S. soldier that fights in the Battle of the Bulge and is subsequently captured by Germans and experiences the bombing of Dresden, an actual historical event from World War II. From there, Billy proceeds to marry a woman he isn't particularly fond of and uses his connection to her to get educated in optometry and get his own practice. At his daughter's wedding, however, Billy gets abducted by Tralfamadorians, aliens who experience time non-linearly. This ends up being the novel's main shtick, as it catalyzes Billy's experiencing time travel, in big air quotes, by jumping from experience to experience, which is mirrored in the structural writing of the book. After constantly jumping between his World War II experiences and being babysat by his overbearing daughter because he rants about his experience with aliens, the book culminates with Billy's experience in the aftermath of the Dresden firebombing. Okay, so let's jump into some topics here. So as I mentioned, the main shtick of this book is the time travel, which is, I guess, the main sci-fi element to this novel. Was it good? And I'm going to go straight to Charlie with this one as someone who has an interest in physics. What did you think of time travel in this?
Well, it's not even really time travel. He's just experiencing time non-linearly. What you said.
It's like
Pretty
the
much
same.
the most
That's the same thing, right?
Straightforward way to put it. No, time travel is like you actually so in your time you are actually traveling forward. You just go into a different part of the time stream. Whereas in the book, it's just like his experience. Instead of living everything in sequence, he lives parts of it out of sequence. It's like if you cut up the movie and then moved all the pieces around and then reshowed the movie.
This is like a really cut up version of a movie, is what you're saying.
I mean, it's like a cut up version of his life.
Yeah. Okay. Do you guys feel like this was an effective, vehicle? I mean, basically the whole book kind of hangs on this concept of him, being unstuck in time, as he puts it. Was it good?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I mean, it's different, and I think different is good. We see a lot of stories with time travel, and this one, although it takes a light touch to how, and by light I mean just totally not explaining, but I think that it is in fact still sci-fi, because for him to be able to perceive time in such a fashion is a different science. It's an effect that is not of our reality. So yeah. I think it qualifies.
He does meet aliens and stuff like that. So
I'm going to argue something kind of controversial. There is no time travel. The man has been through a major war. Over 150,000 people died in one bombing. He was tortured through a lot of that war. I actually kind of felt that it was highly probable that he had PTSD throughout the book, and as an unreliable narrator, he would black out certain time periods and or have attacks and quote-unquote time travel and just think about periods of time in his life, because and the evidence to back that up is actually when he's being transported by the Germans in the train car, and he time travels once. Everyone, when he comes back to the real world, everyone's like, no, don't sleep next to me. You scream and you kick in your sleep. He's like, I do? And they're like, yes. And he had just had a time travel moment, and I was just thinking, oh my God, he just had some sort of PTSD kind of reaction. He was flailing all over the place, and everyone's like, just go away from us, you're crazy. I don't know, how do you guys feel about that?
I totally 100% buy into that. I think that to jump around a little bit and what I want to talk about, but Vonnegut was there and had basically the same experiences as this guy in World War II. And I don't know how affected or not he was by PTSD, but it does sound like he's kind of making up a mechanic to sort of explain kind of strange panicked behavior that someone might have coming out of this kind of war experience.
The thing about following that line of thinking is that this book could theoretically not be a sci-fi book at all, and could be completely just the ravings of a guy who had PTSD. In which case, we just read a war book and a psychology book, but not a sci-fi book.
Dun, dun, dun.
That would be the first time.
It did remind me of Dirk Gently a bit, and I was also like, that was also a book that did not quite fit the definition of sci-fi to me, but
What?
it was much better than Dirk Gently.
I mean, he explains it as time travel, so we kind of have to take it at least a little bit at face value to consider it a science fiction thing. But I think it can totally just be like the dude's messed up from PTSD.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say that's clearly an interpretation that works, because even all the stuff that's in the past where he's clearly referring to the future, like he does it a couple times, it's like, well, that's just the way he's doing it now in his little revision of the past. But I remember for a moment I thought that the author actually basically said it, because they do the thing of like how he dies in the 70s and like Chicago's been bombed out. And I forgot for a moment that this book was written before the 70s. And I was like, oh, he clearly made a fake future for himself, so he is crazy. And I was like, oh, wait, no, this is written before that. And Vonnegut could have written that as an actual future at that point. So I feel like kind of having it be ambiguous whether it's real or not.
It's plausible, but like every book we read, you must believe the author. So it's a sci-fi book.
The man says it's time travel, so it's got to be.
We can debate whether or not that the whole idea of the book stems from that, or that's an inspiration. But in the end, he didn't allude to himself as an unreliable narrator. Hint, hint, not like Annihilation. He didn't give us that impression. He gave us all, for all intents and purposes, we have to believe.
Though, he also gives the very strong impression that if this guy wanted to consciously be an unreliable narrator in sense or form, he was not really capable of that.
Yeah, the one thing that sets this book apart from a lot of the other books too is the kind of first-person nature of it. A lot of the books we read were kind of in the third person, which kind of gives it more of the credit, like the air of fact. Like, this is like, it's a documentary. We're just watching the people through a camera. This guy's like, hey, here's like my journal, here's my life story. Let me tell you what happened to me. And then I got abducted by aliens and blah, 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 blah. So it feels a little bit more unauthentic, but I totally agree with you, John, that if we were to believe it, just like we believe any other book, it would be a sci-fi book. It just feels like there might be an element of uncertainty.
There's a lot of crazy meta-ness happening in this novel, because as I mentioned, Vonnegut was at the Battle of the Bulge and then captured and then experienced the Dresden bombing. And I think at one point, I think it was maybe when he's in the hospital where he's like, yes, I was there. The author of this book was literally there with him.
Because he mentioned something really undignified, like, that guy was taking a dump and making really loud noises and feeling really unpleasant.
Yeah.
That was me, the author, the guy.
Yeah. So there's a lot of like weird, the book's in first person, but Vonnegut himself is a character in here, and
he's Stan Lee.
It's not first person at all. It's all described in third person.
Yeah, it is.
It's just, it's like, it's third person very limited. It's all his direct experience, pretty much. There's like a couple of little asides here and there.
Does anyone know?
Maybe an X-Men origin story or like a Marvel origin story. He's Stan Lee for sure.
Does anybody know if Vonnegut is lying to us, and does anybody know that this is his actual story in real life? Was he actually at the Dresden bombing? He said he was.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He was. He was at the Battle of the Bulge, and he gets captured just like Bill Pilgrim. Although I suspect not in the same way, and I hope he's not the same person, because good lord.
I feel like he implied Billy Pilgrim would not be able to write this book.
Billy Pilgrim is pretty mentally incompetent, but we'll get there. But yeah, just
until he becomes the most famous person in the world.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Spreading the word about four-dimensional time, making everyone feel better. Or four-dimensional space-time.
Get your time travel lingo right, Charlie, or else you're off this show.
We need you, Charlie, to get this right. You're the only one who understands it.
You did one job, Charlie. One job.
Is Charlie okay?
Oh, he's back.
There's no space in this. Well, I guess they went to
No.
space.
No, he went to space. Come on, Charlie, you're wrong again.
And I do like.
this book, Charlie?
So I was gonna say the one thing about the time travel and most things in this book outside of like Dresden itself is it's all seems to be very much like satire, and like I was saying, you know, when they described the aliens, Stavros in our little chat posted a picture of the aliens, and I was like, I don't think I even mentally imagined the aliens. It was just like words in a row meant to sound ridiculous. Like I feel like that's sort of the description of the time travel, the description of Billy Pilgrim's life. All of it is meant to just be this like, look at how pathetic and ridiculous this all is as we ignore the atrocities that actually happened.
That's a good point. But let's move on to another topic here, and I suspect this may be people's favorite part of this novel. The phrase "so it goes." I think it's obviously said after anything dies or tragedy occurs. To me, it felt very dismissive, like so it goes, and it kind of fits within the fatalistic like theme of the novel that Billy Pilgrim has. Everything's predetermined and all that kind of stuff. How did you guys feel about this phrase?
You mean like this podcast? So it goes.
That's exactly right.
Are you insinuating we just died, Charlie?
No.
He's seen the death of this podcast.
This is
Dying a little. He's dying a little inside.
Stavros, it doesn't really die. It's just a static four-dimensional image in space-time that we should be able to enjoy as it exists forever within the confines of 4 dimensions.
Charlie, okay? Does he get PTSD?
Yeah.
He's a Trophadorian, apparently. I thought the phrase was weird. Like I guess I could be convinced that it had maybe literary or plot value, but for me, I just found it to be. I didn't get it. If there was a literary effect to it, I didn't understand it.
So funny story, because I think anyone else audiobook this one or just me? Probably just me.
Stavros, it's always you. Everyone else is.
I got John once.
Stavros.
I read paper.
Reading-
get me sometimes.
Reading is for chumps. Anyway, so the audiobook version I downloaded, or had off Audible.
Narrator, not the rest of the team.
But my version of Slaughterhouse Five that I listened to was narrated by James Franco.
Whoa.
I have the mental image of James Franco saying "so it goes" in about 10 different tones in my head ever since I finished listening to this one. So I'm a little scarred by it, I would say.
You're PTSD too.
Yeah, I'm experiencing
time
time now.
traveling.
Yeah, it's catalyzing my time travel as we speak.
I was about to say, do you keep experiencing those moments over and over again?
That's exactly
As if
it.
In
they're
10 different ways, 10 dimensions.
What do you guys think? It's so kind of lukewarm on this. Is it overused? It's obviously meant to make a statement.
I actually really hated it while I was reading it. I was like, I get it. Every time the word death or something pops up in the paragraph, you're going to end it with "so it goes." And he did it for a good, probably it felt like half the book. And I was like, oh man, it's so overused. I get it. And it annoyed me every time I read it. And then I also realized, maybe a day or two later when I was thinking a little bit more harder about the book, I was like, you know what? Actually, I actually think that it was important that he did it, and important that he annoyed me, because every time someone dies in real life, I should be bothered. It should be like, I lost, the world lost someone. I should be bothered somehow. And it's kind of a sign to me of maybe a lack of humanism. If someone dies in a book, I'm like, okay, cool. It's a sci-fi setting. People die. Let's just move on with the plot. I should actually think a little bit about the nameless people who die a little bit more. So every time he annoyed me, I was like, this is the base amount of emotion I should feel. I should feel more than just annoyed every time someone dies. So I kind of backtracked a little bit. I was like, okay, you know what? I accept it. I accept the fact that you use that mechanism. It annoyed the crap out of me, but I should be annoyed every time someone dies. So I'll give it to you. I actually kind of liked it in retrospect, even though I still hate it. It's a love-hate relationship.
That's kind of what I was saying. A lot of the book is set up to point out where we kind of devalue stuff that should be intensely valued. Or, it's it almost points out where we're being dismissive, where obviously we shouldn't be, and vice versa.
Yep, that's fair. But yeah, it's strange that he uses it in a dismissive way, but is so obnoxious about it that it makes us care about it.
And the crazy thing is he uses, science fiction or even just straight up pseudoscience babble to kind of justify it. Like, the aliens have this perspective. Oh, that's exactly how it works. They can, it's not like people die. It's just that it's kind of like, imagine it's just kind of like they were not taller is how the aliens see it or something like that.
It annoyed me, and I actually kind of enjoy the annoyedness in retrospect. Don't make me read it.
I think that's how, like, a lot of it's like where you're like, what's wrong with this guy? What's wrong with these guys? What's wrong with all these people?
I feel like you're kind of like a reading masochist there. You're just like, it annoyed me. I liked it.
A little bit, yeah.
Just a little.
It adds character, flavor to the
light
character.
Okay. So that kind of leads into the next topic, which is, this is obviously an anti-war novel. And I feel like on top of that, it's very, there's a lot of disillusionment in the United States here. So he goes about this in a lot of different ways, and we can dive into this deep dive, but I'll just mention a few of them. Just the way that the Americans are portrayed. For example, pretty much all the American soldiers that Billy Pilgrim runs into before and after he's captured, and then in stark contrast to the British POWs who are kind of portrayed as like kind of godlike, epitomes of mankind kind of stuff. And even the main character himself, talk about annoyance in this book. This main character annoyed the hell out of me. He's passive, kind of lame. He's hard to sympathize with. Fatalistic, especially after he has the encounter with the Tralfamadorians, and of course you pile on the Dresden critique, which for those, I guess people might not even know. I didn't even know until I read this book. Dresden was a firebombing of a non-military German civilian city right at the tail end of World War II that was basically used as a statement against the Russians for post-war times. We just firebombed the shit out of it. Lots of people died. So there's a lot here where he's just taken. I don't think there are any real positive American characters in here at all. What did you guys think of this?
I think there was one positive American character. The guy who got shot for taking the teacup. He seemed kind of like a nice guy.
He's kind of punished for being good, kind of.
Like, I was gonna say he was kind of a nice guy, and then he gets shot for looting at the very end.
Yeah, but the British were way better. Like, they were obviously much cooler than like the Americans, though. It seemed kind of odd because I thought I remember the British being like I thought I remember the Europeans being battered and the Americans coming in all chipper and dapper and stuff like that, and quote unquote riding in to save the day, even though they didn't really do very much.
I'm sure 90% of the reason it's portrayed this way is to deconstruct that myth.
Yeah. I got that impression
like
too.
even like the thing where it's like the British are awesome, it's also kind of pathetic because they were captured like day one, and it's like, well, at least we can be strong and have our theater and shave and keep up our good spirits, even though we're just hanging out with a bunch of sad Russians and don't even see like animals or anything. We're just kind of hanging out for the war.
Yeah, I want to add to that thought actually, because I thought the same thing, Charlie. He talks about the British soldiers in ways that we would associate with positivity, like they're strong and they seem to be adjusted to living in captivity and they haven't given up on all the things in life, but they seem totally disconnected with what's going on around them. They're in the middle of a prison camp where people are dying.
It's just like another image of absurdity in the novel with all the situations.
My reaction to that was that, these guys are in a possibly worse situation than the captured Americans, but they kind of allowed, they kept themselves up, whereas the Americans just got there and they're just horrible people on top of horrible health conditions and that kind of stuff. Yeah. I just got it as, not a good thing.
Even with them being positive, it's almost a cartoon where it's like, oh, look, they tried to escape, so we put them with the Russians. So if they tried to escape again, they'd just be hanging out with Russians. And, now they're in their sad little Russian cage.
The whole situation is totally unrealistic, too. The one set of British troops that he runs into in this POW camp is the one that got the extra provisions, and it's some ridiculous amount of like thousands of pounds of provisions, and the Germans are like totally okay giving them all this, like, here, you need more wood to store all of your goods. No, it wouldn't happen. This is 1945 Germany. Germany's on the back heel. They need supplies. They would just come in and take them, I imagine. I don't know. I didn't find that to be a plausible story, other than the fact that the author told us.
Anyway, so aside the PW situation aside, though, as far as the American portrayal, regardless of how realistic the British are, and if you take into account what happens with the Americans at the PW camp and the obvious critique of the Dresden bombing, and pretty much any other American character, I don't know. Like, my personal reaction to this was, like, it felt like a clear critique of Americans in general. And, of course, like, as a product of American culture upbringing, I'm used to thinking like, oh, Americans are the best. And of course I know that not every American is a knight in shining armor type, but I kind of finished this book with kind of just disgust, and not really with Americans, but more with like I know that not every American is a dick. What's this guy kind of doing, just making this portrait of, Americans in this book like this? But did any of you guys have that reaction?
Europeans rule, Americans rule.
Yeah.
It seems to say that, with Billy Pilgrim being so pathetic, it's like, if you're not one of those creepy jerks that he runs across, you are the unwitting idiot in the room.
What do you mean by that?
You are Billy Pilgrim if you're not the cutthroat jerkwad that's one of these other American people.
Yeah, the main character too. God, totally unlikable, and he just kind of by random luck gets his life in order, sort of, and with this job he has.
That's you, Stavros.
It's true.
Yeah, he was. I felt like he was very disillusioned with America, with Americans, and maybe with American triumphalism. The Americans came in and they won the war along with the rest of the Allies, and they really treated themselves as the winners.
Yeah.
And
plus, this was written during Vietnam, and even in the time travel, there's a couple of references to like, we believe, the Vietnam War and stuff like that. So I could see, even with it being like a direct criticism of something like the bombing at Dresden, it's also meant to have a then more contemporary message.
Yeah, I think the timing of the publish really points that out for sure. But were you guys kind of more like, oh yeah, I guess we're not as awesome as we thought, or were you just kind of on where I was at, where I was like, oh really, like this is just kind of overkill? This isn't what Americans are like?
Well, I think Americans should accept truth, and I think that at the time that this book was written, the Dresden bombing, if the public knew, would not see themselves as the ethical, moral center of a political fight with the Soviet Union. That we painted them as unethical in the way that they did war, and the Germans as well. Really, all the Axis powers. And I'm not disagreeing with that, because I think it's probably a good criticism, but it's probably also acceptable to say, well, Americans should also look at the things that we would not be proud of, that are not that dissimilar from what, in some ways, was done by all parties in the war.
I don't know. If he wanted to send a credible message to the American public, I think he should have left out the hand eyeball aliens who abducted him. And there's I was reading the book, and I was kind of taking it all as like, oh, these are the delusions of a man who went through a very horrible experience, and what he does or doesn't remember. You're lumping in the aliens along with, like, whether or not the Americans were cool or not. And I'm just like, they could all be very unreliable. Like, if he really wasn't abducted by aliens, maybe the Americans really weren't that bad off. But I just treat it all as fiction at that point.
Yeah.
For better.
I mean, I treated the aliens and the time travel and stuff like that as an emphasis of, we are all these stupid fantasy idiots. And he's trying to re-emphasize that point where pretty much everything besides the war is just making people look bad. Like, all of these aspects of your life are just you being a pathetic idiot because America.
Yeah, I think that so I actually saw a direct link between the time travel portion of this, well, the Trophadorians specifically, because they don't see it the way Billy Pilgrim does, or any humans do. They see the entirety of history all at one time. And when Billy talks to him about how they deal with this fact, because there's obviously, if you see all of it, then you see good and bad, And they say that we don't really look at the bad parts, we only look at the good parts. And I think that's a really good comparison to what what the author is trying to get across about how Americans are really only interested in looking at the good parts and not necessarily looking at the parts where we may have done things that we would, in retrospect, not think were in line with our values that we proclaim.
Like, it's to the point where the aliens, when Billy Pilgrim's like, we're terrible people, we might destroy the universe, the aliens are like, oh no, we already know, we're gonna do that, we're gonna be the idiots who destroy the universe. But, you just try to ignore that and just look at the parts of space-time that are cool and nice.
Yeah,
that's true.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we're running short on time, so let's go into final thoughts here. I'll go first. Aside from my kind of pride-based disgust in the portrayal of Americans here, there are some interesting issues. I'm glad, honestly, I didn't even know about, like I said, the Dresden bombing. I didn't even know. And I don't even think it's common knowledge. So it's a good thing to know, like you said, John. Having the truth come out is something that's important here. As far as the time travel jumping around thing, I don't know if it super sold me on the quality of the book. It's different, like you said. I don't really know if that made that good, so I'm kind of lukewarm on that. But as far as the kind of anti-war message and the kind of skepticism of America, I could get on board with that. So let's go to Charlie. What do you think, Charlie? Final thoughts.
Why am I always first? But anyway.
I love you the most.
You know what? Despite any of the details we've been talking about, I felt that in terms of its criticism and kind of its dismissal of a lot of the kind of surface level stuff of Americans and whatnot, that it was effective in its criticism and getting you to think about, wait, are we really that? Like, because I also felt the same, like, hey, that's not us. But it got me thinking about it and thinking about some of the details and everything, and it's like I almost want to go spend more time kind of looking this stuff up and moving on, trying to get more out of this, which I feel like means that it did its job.
Okay. How about you, John?
I think the book, I'm gonna second that. I think the book did a sufficiently good job of using a science fiction element to change our perspective and show us something that we may not have known about or that we weren't aware of. And I just thought it was an interesting way to present that topic. The book is written in these little vignette stories where he sort of blinks and becomes a different person. I think it's different. I did find it a little bit more difficult to read, but I also, I'm not usually in the framework that different is better. But different in this case was fine. I don't think
neither good nor bad, just fine. It was fine. Like,
it was different. If you're looking for a book that's different, that reads differently, then I would read this book. We haven't read a book I think like it. It definitely felt different.
All right, how about you, Vincent? Final thoughts.
So if I had to sum up this book in one phrase, I would say this book was summer homework from high school. It's not enjoyable enough to have been something that you chose of your own free will, just moralistic enough and just learning based enough to be justified as school curriculum. But at the same time, it's like not quite fun enough that you're like, oh, that was such a good read. It's more like I'm ready to write an essay about it, and some of the maybe analogies that through some symbolism, maybe some metaphors, blah blah blah. I would say that it is, of course, a good book because it makes you think about like historical events, like what the truth is of the situation. It makes you think about PTSD, makes you think about soldiers and the horrors that they had to live through. As a sci-fi book, it's not. I read sci-fi and stuff like that to kind of get away from the world, to like enjoy myself in a world where I don't really, where everything's brand new. This world is definitely brand new, but not in the fun way. It's more like it's a little too real and a little too scary, and not something I would choose to use my free time on when I could be reading like Dune or some other books which are like, wow, how creative, how interesting. I don't know, it's hard. I think it speaks more about me than it does about other people. So I would have to recommend the book as an interesting book that is thought-provoking, but at the same time very quick to read and maybe very lighthearted and kind of crazy with aliens and stuff like that, but not my cup of tea personally. A little bit more Dirk Gently meets kind of more realistic kind of world.
Okay. Well, great. Well, that about wraps up this episode. So, of course, if you have feedback or suggestions on books we should read and discuss, you should email us at subplotofcourse@gmail.com, or you can tweet us at subplotpodcast. And for next month's episode, we're going to be talking about 1984, the Orwellian novel published in 1949. Say goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Don't
So
forget
it
to check out our
goes.
Bitcoin channel.
Damn it.
SPAC Bitcoin.